I can kind of see from the room size, a few of you like me have a few gray hairs. And it was interesting as I was thinking about where we find ourselves today. So September 11th, right? And I think back 17 years ago, I think back to a day that millions of Americans, myself included, will always remember, and will remember maybe where they were that day. For me, it was interesting because I went to the office unusually late that day, and I was walking across the Lyric Opera Bridge around 9:30 in the morning, and I couldn't figure out why thousands of people were walking back towards the train stations. Something you would typically see kind of in the evening, certainly not at 9:30 in the morning. And as we all know, we didn't have smartphones. We didn't have the ability to scroll through our thumbs for social media. We certainly didn't have audio apps or news apps or things that we could live stream on our phones. And I happened to have not seen the news at all that morning. And by chance, I ran into a few of my coworkers that were trying to get to a train, and they tried to explain what happened. So what did we do? We, of course, did what you used to do then. You would try to get in front of a TV and see what was happening on the news. So that's a morning that I won't forget. Flash forward to this morning, where I had the opportunity to spend my morning with Killian Anderson. Killian Anderson runs the Pat Tillman Foundation. And it was quite a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to him this morning for the Brand Lab series. And we talked a lot about September 11th, because obviously that was a pivotal moment in Pat's life and led him down a path. And we talked about everything from what it's like to run marketing for a nonprofit, what it's like to market a brand that's based on an individual's legacy. And of course, I asked him, what is it like when your brand gets pulled into a rabbit hole of a culture war on social media? We talked about Colin Kaepernick and Nike and the NFL. So that's a new episode that will be airing for our 4th season. So I would encourage you guys to subscribe to the podcast. We'll talk more about that later. But at the end of the interview, Killian reached into his pocket and he pulled out this coin. And I wasn't sure what it was. And I have it here now. And if any of you have been in the military, or if any of you have a military family member or a spouse, this is a challenge coin. And in the military, it's something that's really held in high regard. And he handed this to me and said, "You're forever now a friend of the Pat Tillman Foundation." And I said, you know, I love awards, I love accolades, but this is something that I don't think I can accept. And I certainly don't think I can accept it on today of all days. And he insisted, and he even gave one to Alexa and Charlie, who were there with me on the team as well. And as he walked away, I was still kind of in awe that he gave this to me. But then I remembered that this is actually why I started the Brand Lab series. It wasn't for the awards. It certainly wasn't for a military coin. It was because I wanted to have conversations with people that I found to be inspiring. I wanted to have conversations with people that would make me a better person, would make my team better, would certainly make me a better marketer. And it was really this bittersweet moment that I wouldn't have forever seen, but it really all kind of came full circle. So what I want to talk about today is a little bit about our podcast journey. We're a smaller group, so I certainly want to keep it intimate in the sense of if you have some questions, feel free to ask them, or we can obviously hold some of them to the end as well. But so about 3 years ago, I had the idea of the Brand Lab series podcast, really for 2 reasons. I touched on a bit the fact that I wanted to have content that would help me grow as an individual and as a marketer and benefit our team. It also happened that I was a lousy blog writer. And from a content marketing perspective back in the day, I found that I was still writing most of the blog content for AE. And I said, I'm much more comfortable talking to people. I'm much more comfortable speaking to people than I ever am writing to people. So why don't we look at doing a podcast? So flash forward to where we are today. And the podcast this year was named the top business and technology podcast by the Academy of Interactive and Visual Arts. The other 3 winners were ABC for News, ESPN for Sports, and the Brookings Institute for Education. So over the last 3 years, we've had a number of top executives, entrepreneurs from some of the leading brands, including the CEO of LaSalle Network, Tom Gimbel, who is a great guest. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about, if you are podcasting, or if you're thinking about podcasting, some of the things that we've learned on our journey, and how you can apply those to your own thinking, but then also how does that just relate to what we do in general as marketers? You know, thinking about the marketplace and understanding, should you podcast? And is it right for you, whether you're a consultant, whether you're a student, whether you're on the brand side or the agency side? How to avoid a Me Too podcast. And there are millions of Me Too podcasts. I'll talk a little bit about that. How to speak your audience's language. Why quality is always going to trump quantity. And I know that that seems like a no-brainer, but it's pretty interesting based upon some stuff that I'll talk about as it relates to that. And then finally about building awareness and revenue. So the first question is podcasting right for your brand? And what's pretty interesting is, how many of you listen to a podcast? So pretty much most of the whole room. So the average podcast skews younger, is better educated, and is typically more affluent than the average consumer purchaser. However, they spend a lot of time when they're listening to podcasts on different devices, different platforms. Sometimes there's subscription. They're often on the go, which is why they use different platforms. And that makes them a little hard to try to pin down, though, in terms of engaging that audience. So it creates a little bit of an interesting marketing dilemma. So I want to just talk for a minute or two about some global metrics, and then we'll drill into a few things to really understand the market and see if it's something worth pursuing for you. So based upon the show of hands, these numbers are actually pretty light, because what was interesting is that 44% of all Americans have listened to at least one podcast. What's more interesting is you start to drill into those numbers, you'll find that 1 in 4 people listen to a podcast every month, and 1 in 5 listen to 4 or more a week, which is pretty crazy from the top line. So obviously it creates this big market. So there's this big pool of people that like to consume content. But if we could drill a little deeper into who that is in a minute, but what's been interesting is the podcast industry grows and the audience grows, so is the ad revenue from a business perspective associated with podcasting. Why $660 million may seem relatively small in the global sense of worldwide marketing, just from the US perspective, it's one of the fastest growing segments of digital related advertising. So what do we know now? We know that the market is getting bigger. We know that the ad side of that market is getting bigger. So what do we do as marketers? So we obviously want to look closer at data, and that's who's listening. Most of you all raised your hand, but if you look closer at the data, the level of men that have watched or listened to a video or a podcast has really plateaued. The growth is really coming from women, and more importantly, younger women. You might be surprised, as you see up there, that women are listening on average 5.5 hours a week to podcast content. And millennials make up 64% of what's called a heavy podcast user. And the industry norm for a heavy podcast user, if you could believe it or not, is 7 or more in a week. And I happen to have, I won't put all of them on the spot, but one of them happens to be in the room. So I have a millennial who works for me. She's an avid podcast listener, so she falls right into that bucket as well. But again, if you look a little closer at this through the eye of a marketer, why is this important? If you're a consumer marketer, who are we always trying to go after? We're trying to go after women. Why? Because they typically run the household. I know they do in mine. And they're usually the ones making a lot of the purchasing decisions. For years, marketers have been struggling with how do we connect with millennials. So I thought it was very interesting from a consumer-facing standpoint that the audience that is most active and growing on podcasting is in fact young millennial women. And in fact, the woman that's up there, Elizabeth Taverny founded Charge, which is one of the fastest growing national female empowerment and wellness brands. She happened to be on our show. She started her company as an internship while she was at Ohio State University. It's growing gangbusters across the US. And actually, as a result of being on our podcast, they decided to start one as well. But what if you're a B2B marketer? And I know we have a mix of some people in the room. What's also really interesting is based upon the 2018 podcast Westwood Ad Age study, a shocking 2/3 of advertising decision makers are talking about marketing content, have participated in podcasts to talk about marketing content. So that shows also from a B2B perspective that that audience is also highly engaged. And this was a group of 6 CEOs and C-level executives from technology, from CPG, including Procter & Gamble and others. They were all getting together and talking about marketing through the lens of podcasting. So whether you're looking to be a B2C entity or you're a B2C consultant or brand, there's obviously an audience for you. If you're a B2B, there's obviously an audience for you as well. But the trick is, how do you not have a Me Too podcast? So as I've talked a little bit about, it's a rapidly growing industry in terms of the number of people that consume the content. It's a rapidly growing industry in terms of the ad content related to that. But if you look across any platform, you'll notice that there are hundreds and hundreds of podcasts for marketing, for technology, maybe even for chemistry, I'm not sure. But I know that there are an incredible amount of podcasts for almost everything. And we as marketers sometimes might look at this big universe and say, well, this is a great opportunity. Well, my concern would be if you have a large audience and a lot of competition, you're really looking like you're swimming in a red ocean. And it's very challenging because you have hyper competition. People are getting inundated with content. It's incredibly complex to try to get share of interest and share of mind, and in the case of a podcast, a share of download. So how do you try to do something different? And I think that that's a really hard challenge for a marketer because sometimes we're so quick to try to do what everyone else does because we think that's what's going to work. When I think when we set out to do the Brand Lab Series podcast, we said, what are our goals? And I already mentioned earlier that one of our biggest goals was how do we learn and grow and inspire as individuals and as a team? But then the next layer of that was I wanted to have conversations with either a big brand executive or an up-and-coming entrepreneur and have it as an interview conversation style. Again, I'm not the first and I will not be the last that created that type of a podcast format. The reason why it was slightly different, though, is if you look across most of marketing, there's only a couple of styles of podcasts. Oftentimes, it's an individual, and he or she is talking about a topic, and there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes they've had hands-on experience with that topic, and other times they haven't. Or you might have a couple of consultants in the room, maybe talking about something like the Nike ad with Colin Kaepernick and all of that, and social media. But to me, I would rather talk to the people that are actually doing it and experiencing it, and how can we learn from him or her? And we wanted to choose big brand executives because we felt that he or she would have a lot of great operational experience. They would really know a lot about running a business over a long period of time. For example, I mentioned the CEO of LaSalle Network, Tom Gimbel, who was a guest in season 3, I believe. His company is now 20 years old, so his experience level of running a company and scaling a company of that size is vastly different from some of our other guests that we've had on. The flip side is the up-and-coming entrepreneur has the ability to be agile, has the ability to probably innovate better, and we thought that they would be a good complement to each other so that we could learn, but then they would learn from one another and kind of create this ecosystem of Brand Lab Series guests. So that for us was a big reason why we didn't want to be a Me Too. And I think if you want to set out to do a podcast, it's really important to ask yourself, who are we as a brand? What are our goals? And who's our audience? And I think that's a really important aspect in terms of understanding the language that they speak. So for us, when we looked at these different audiences and made a determination of who would be on or who we would like to have on the Brand Lab series, we thought about the types of topics that we solve for our own customers. So our company typically focuses on B2B, although we do have some B2C brands as well. And we're usually dealing with C-level executives. So we're always thinking about what are the types of challenges that they have from a business perspective, and how can our external audience of Brand Lab Series guests help them grow as well. So a good example would be one of our customers who we now actually have as a result of the Brand Lab Series, Mediafly, which is just across the street, which is a fast-growing B2B tech company, 5 times on the Inc. 5000 list. We're 3 times on the Inc. 5000 list. So we're able to talk a lot about hyper-growth together and what we've learned together and mistakes that we've made along the way and how to get to that next level up. And it's really about being able to not just talk the talk, but walk the walk. And that's a big thing for us, is making sure that we don't have guests on that we don't feel like we can all benefit from one another, and we all have some kind of shared experiences. One of the things that I was joking with Chris about before we started is when we first set out, of course, what did I do? You went and you talked to people that were already podcasting, and how do we learn? And one of the big things that we were consistently told is, well, if you're going to podcast, you have to podcast regularly. And you have to be consistent in podcasting, because if you're not, people will kind of forget about you, and it'll be harder to grow audience. So our first season, we actually did 34 episodes, and we had one almost every single Tuesday for 34 weeks straight. Simultaneously, we were trying to run a business, service our customers. I'm also a dad of 2 young kids, so this was just a lot. But what was interesting is we started to realize that this idea of quantity over quality was ultimately compromising our own vision and our intent for the Brand Lab series. That if we were so focused on who's going to be our next guest, what are we doing 2 weeks from now, that we ran the potential of not being true to ourselves and maybe inviting on someone that we wouldn't want to have on, or that maybe wouldn't be a good guest, or compromising some of our standards. And we began to realize that the quality of what we did mattered far more than the quantity. Flash forward to where we are today, we haven't done a new episode since the end of last year. Now we're about to launch our entire 4th season. We're shooting them like a TV series, so we're doing them all at once, and then we'll start distributing them starting next month. But we said, let's make sure that we continue to grow our community, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. And let's continue to make sure that we have the right guests. Season 4 will include, obviously, everyone from the Pat Tillman Foundation to American Express to GE Healthcare and many others. And it was that methodical weighting of making sure that we had the right audience, the right guests, and really aligning them all before we did that. Something else that's also talked about often in the area of podcasting is reach. It's a common marketing term, right? So we decided to do our own test on this. So we had a particular guest on, and he was a good guest. I won't name the name, but what was interesting is he swore by the fact that all you have to do to build a podcast audience is have people with large social media followings. And all they have to do is tweet out once or twice how great their experience was, how great your Brand Lab series podcast is, and then suddenly you'll see a surge in your audience. Well, turns out that didn't work. What's interesting is our most successful podcast comes from someone that has the absolute smallest social media footprint you will ever see. He barely spends any time on social media. But what he talked about, which was Bob Mesta and the Jobs to Be Done mind frame and strategy set, which is all about consumers don't buy products, they hire products for a particular job. Bob is probably one of the smartest people I've ever met. He's designed or launched over 3,000 products. He's the reason why every car has a triangle that tells you what side of it the gasoline tank is on, because he was working in Japan, and after returning rental cars every month, he said, I don't know what side of the car this gas tank is on, so they had to figure out how to solve for that. He's dyslexic, so he doesn't spend a lot of time on technology. His podcast went off the charts. And it, again, reminded us that it's all about the quality, not necessarily the quantity. So that's really something that I would tell you to give some thought to. The flip side of the quality also is the fact that as you look at the revenue perspective, all of you that raised your hand, it wasn't a matter of you happened to be somewhere and the radio was on. You had intent to actually listen to a podcast. So it's more of a lean-in medium than, say, radio, or even perhaps TV or something that might occasionally be on in the background. So when you look at some of the data, ad recall, for example, if you do have ads within your podcast, is significantly higher statistically than you would ever see in radio. And especially because a lot of the ads that fall within podcasts generally relate to the episode itself. Sometimes they're read by the host. So it creates more of a trust factor that you typically wouldn't get otherwise. So it's something to think about. Now, I'll talk about revenue in a couple minutes, but our intent was never, and to this point is still not, to include any type of advertising in our podcast. But it's just pretty interesting to know that the ad recall and awareness is very high. And there were some statistics and data that I realized that I'll talk about in a minute that were really kind of eye-opening to us as well. And as I mentioned, it's more of a lean-in, intentional medium. But I also want to talk about the lens of brand awareness in addition to revenue, which I'll talk about in a minute. So from a brand awareness perspective, Charlie made it very clear that I'm not allowed to pitch AE Marketing Group, and that's not why I'm here today. But what I do want to tell you is very interesting is that AE Marketing Group is almost 8 years old. For the first 5 years of our company, we spent all of our time focusing on growing the company, but more importantly, growing our customers' business. And one day we were sitting around and I said, wow, this is interesting. We're a brand company and no one knows who the heck we are. We have to fix that problem. That's where the idea of blogging came, and I told you earlier how that worked out for us. But what's interesting about the brand building perspective is we had this goal of the podcast to make us better as people, to make us better as marketers, business people, and just to build community together. So we started doing that, and then we noticed something that was kind of interesting. It was kind of like the snowball in a Charlie Brown cartoon, that it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And suddenly we had the head of IoT for IBM on. Then we had the global head of innovation for Bosch on. Then we had the CMO of Deloitte on. And it just kind of became this momentum effect where suddenly we were getting audiences with people that if we had ever cold called them, and I know there's some salespeople in the room, and said, hey, I'm Brian, I'm with AE Marketing Group, they would have said, thanks, but no. We have an agency, we don't want to talk to you. They would probably not even pick up the phone. But the reality was we started getting audiences and having conversations with people that we otherwise would have never had as a small, fast-growing company. And so flash forward to where we are today, one of the things we did to also maintain that sense of quality and community is every year we host a reception for everyone that's been on the episodes that season. And we're trying to build community among them. These are all executives or entrepreneurs. Some of them have started to do business together amongst themselves. They've built their own relationships. And we've really been careful about that. And the interesting part is it's totally raised our brand profile more than any marketing campaign that we could have ever done for us ourselves as individuals. And we're now in the process of talking to people who have even been on the show about actually doing their marketing for them. Now, as someone who started in sales, I'm sitting there saying, why did I never realize that a podcast could be a business development tool? But it was never our intent, and it's not our primary goal by any means, but it's been interesting how organically people within our community, and ourselves included, are now doing business with people who have been on our show. But then if you look at it through the consumer lens, what's also very interesting across mobile podcast listeners, of all the data I've thrown at you, I thought this one was shocking for two reasons. So 41% of people who have listened to a podcast, that's 4 out of 10 who've listened to it on a mobile device, actually looked up a product or service that they heard an ad on that podcast. That's tremendous, which gets back to that ad recall perspective. Most marketers would kill for that type of active engagement. And then what's even more striking is 28% of them actually then bought a product or a service based upon hearing on a podcast. And as I was reviewing those numbers with Alexa last week, I said, that can't be true. And then all of a sudden I said, well, wait a minute. I sleep on a Casper mattress because I heard Casper on a podcast. And I now have not 1, not 2, but 3 Away bags because I heard Away on a podcast. And I'm like, oh wait, that's me. And so it's very interesting if you look to potentially try to monetize your brand through the use of ad revenue. Clearly all the data suggests that it does in fact work, which gets back to the fact that you are a engaged audience, and if you can provide them with some good content and some quality content, they're more likely to take some kind of an action. So as we look to kind of wrap up a bit, and then I want to open it up for some questions, a little bit on where to hear and now where to see the Brand Lab Series podcast. So these are all the platforms that you can see or listen to our show on. One of the other things that is interesting about season 4 is that at the end of season 3, we started saying, wow, we're having all these great conversations, but we're only providing our audience really one medium right now, and that is the audio medium. And we said, well, why don't we start producing all of this stuff? We're a marketing company. We've done very large documentaries. We do commercial campaigns. Like, why aren't we videotaping these conversations? So then we realized we did a test with Procter & Gamble and a few others and Bosch, and it was very successful to be able to do it that way. So the other reason why we deliberately waited to launch our 4th season is because everyone, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2, has a video element of their interview as well. So as I mentioned kind of back at the beginning, we shot the Pat Tillman Foundation this morning for September 11th. We were shooting all last week, shooting again next week. We'll continue to do that. Just because we all know as marketers, the more content you have, the more people you will reach based upon the way that they like to consume content. And we've also realized that the visual clips are far better for driving the initial engagement to get people to actually go to one of these channels and be able to download those.